Okay, so last we left it, we were talking about how the state has established a monopoly over grain, and it's using the surpluses from that grain as a way to pay as its capital to create new factories and purchase new technologies that will push forward China's industrialization. And the conflict that that then creates with these cooperatives and communes then is the state decides how much is tax, which is very low, but it also decides how much is effectively a surplus, and then also allocates back to that community that produced that grain how much food and other resources it will have in a given year to survive on. And as we mentioned, the amounts being relegated to these communities to continue to feed themselves are actually at a level that's below the caloric intake set by international standards that people need for their bodies and minds to flourish. So already they're making a sacrifice just in the ways in which their bodies are being developed by consuming less food than a lot of health experts say that they should. But there's also a political conflict that comes from this. Making matters worse, the size of the surplus is not based on agricultural studies or projections by the work teams, or even the last harvest, but instead by the party before the year, based on its anticipated need for revenue to fuel the growth of the industrial sector. In some, it's a quota demanded by Beijing that communities had to meet, even if it meant that they would have far less to eat in the coming year, or in essence, to meet it by any means necessary. The key then to rural politics for team leaders and this new elite that was rising to replace the old class that was being forcefully pushed down and eventually having their land stripped from them in very violent means, as you're going to read from Spence. Land reform, taking land from absentee or very, very, very wealthy, although a minimal part of the population of landlords in the countryside, is going to result in the deaths in the millions from conflict and violence within communities that's pushed and sponsored by the state. But the key for this new elite was to exceed that quota, a performance that could make your star rise in the party. The opposite, though, was also true. And as senior party members became the patrons of new members and young officials, there was the added risk of you not meeting that quota for your work production team for grain and shaming your whole entire network, including a senior party member. This system spurred competition within communes, between teams, or across the nation between areas and communes, which at times was good and could drive higher production, right? Competition is good. But it also incentivized manipulating the divisions of the harvest to serve one's career or the party over the actual rural masses of China as a whole. The team leader could use all kinds of threats and punishments to produce more grain. And on the other end, from below, it also created widespread resistance from rural Chinese who tried to hold back the fruits of their labor. They underreported it. They delivered grain after dark. They held back or hid huge quantities of grain, basically leaving it out in the field ungleaned so that it could feed animals that they could then use throughout the winter or sell in sideline productions to bring in a greater profit. And they even went to efforts to try and hide newly reclaimed land from traveling inspectors and brigade teams. There were 100 different forms of deception that they tried, but ultimately most were uncovered. In sum, one last way to think about this new system is that the government eventually had become the penultimate landlord. It was systematically exploiting peasants who were held at a subsistence level. By the late 1950s, its members that had once labored in the countryside along villagers by now had spent a decade in the nation's largest cities, removed from their plight, the plight of rural villagers, and eager to see all spare grain possible used to build factories with the latest technology and the latest weaponry for the People's Liberation Army. Worse, the institution of a hukou, a residency permit, which required government approval for a person to change occupations or move to cities, essentially locked rural Chinese into boxes in the countryside. Only there could their hukou serve as a ration card and get them food and other resources necessary to live. One important caveat here is that the Chinese Communist Party in this era also presided over enormous success in two areas: improving public health and expanding universal education. For the first time ever, all Chinese in the countryside, men and women, were going to learn to read and go to schools with a chance to go on to middle, high school, and even college, where a certain number of positions were set aside for people from the poorest and most marginalized class backgrounds. Before this time, tens of millions of Chinese were illiterate, and most, the majority, had no formal education. Within the decade, the percentage of children enrolled in China's primary schools rose from 25% of its population to 50%. From this point forward, that percentage went from the majority to being minuscule, on and on and on, until almost entirely the nation had universal education. Secondly, the state's oversight of basic campaigns to improve public hygiene and use of inoculations and vaccines is going to drastically reduce a number of diseases that had ravaged rural populations for the past century. A point that I like to tell a lot of students when kind of analyzing the impact of Mao and his policies on China is, after we detail the horrors of the Great Leap Forward, where millions die, and the Cultural Revolution, where again, much of China's gains in terms of economic development are squandered on social and political conflict within the country, is that despite those great grand errors and the millions that die with Mao as responsible in the 1960s, that even then, the average life expectancy of most Chinese at the beginning of his term in 1949 is in the low 30s, especially in the countryside. And even with millions dying of starvation and violence in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, that life expectancy by the time Mao dies in 1976 is going to be well into the 60s, adding nearly 30 years to life. And a lot of that is the fruits of just basic reforms launched to improve education, scientific agriculture, public hygiene, and improve people's access to modern medicine. And that happens a lot of times in just this first decade. Okay. To wrap up the conclusion on China's golden age, you can see there are a number of benefits that China is going to reap from the founding of a very strong central government with the capacity to make widespread changes, although we're going to also see the underside of that when we get into next week's lecture. It's a world power again, its sovereignty is completely restored, and its intervention in North Korea and the Korean War and its animosity and ideological opposition to the United States and to capitalism is going to make it a source of inspiration for much of the third world and communist and socialist states in places like Vietnam and Ghana. It's going to initially reap the benefits of choosing the Soviet Union in the Cold War, the Soviet aid, and especially the advice of its technicians and things like the military, the educational system, and its infrastructure are going to lay the basis that some can even claim is the foundation for China's later economic miracle in the 1970s and 1980s. It's also the high point at which communism is believed to be a solution to all the nation's ills, and people have high faith in the government in Beijing, that the public officials are trusted and largely admired by the people again, something that hasn't happened for many, many decades. And that those people in place actually make real effective changes, eliminating things like vice, opium addiction, prostitution, and expanding things like education. And it's also a time in which a lot of people find security and a social safety net, the iron rice bowl. They find that communism may not be a perfect system, but it is a system that offers them employment, low-cost housing, pensions, healthcare, and subsidized food. But most of those benefits are being built inside the cities and are to a privileged few in those areas at the cost of the rural masses who are living below those standards out in the countryside and seeing much of the fruits of their labor siphoned off in order to guarantee the iron rice bowl for many others. Okay. Lots to go through here. Obviously, we're getting into some very controversial topics. Not that any of modern China is all that non-controversial. But if you do have questions or concerns after these lectures or things that you just want me to clarify, please shoot me some questions. I'm going to try and post an announcement about your exam. I'm going to try and reduce the scale and the scope of that exam to make it a little bit easier. As always, stay in good health, stay inside, stay to your studies. And if you can't do any of those things or need help with anything at all, please let me know what I can do to make your semester successful.